The first page of your novel is definitely the hardest to write. Actually, the second page is probably harder because you're tired from writing the first page. Your first page is critical. Until they've read the second page, 100% of what the reader thinks about your novel is determined by what's on the first page. So getting it right and avoiding common problems is critical. There are a lot of mistakes that can happen on the first page of your novel, and they can have an outsized impact on what people think about it. I've certainly made a lot of these mistakes, and I want to help you avoid them as well. Speaking of things you shouldn't avoid, consider subscribing to my channel. It will help you avoid boredom and not getting writing advice videos. All right, the first mistake we're going to talk about is also about the first part of your first page, and that is focusing too much on your first line rather than your first paragraph. The opening line of a novel gets a lot of attention, and it's definitely important. In general, I think the importance of the first line is overstated. You'll see people warn that if your first line, your opening sentence, is not a groundbreaking treatise on literary excellence, then your reader will immediately set the book on fire and not read another word of it. I don't think that that's necessarily true, and I think you get a lot more mileage out of focusing on the first beat or the first paragraph of your novel rather than the opening line itself. A clear opening sentence that sets the scene for the reader in a way that they can understand is a great way to open the story. Your second or third line can be where you present something compelling or something that grabs the reader's attention. Describe the character digging a hole in your first line, then mention that this is the third body that they've buried that night in your second line. A great first line that's followed by a boring or confusing opening is going to quickly erode any interest the reader has for your story. Your first line should be part of a system that draws the reader into your story, and what comes after it needs to get as much, if not more, attention. Shift your focus away from the first sentence and instead think about the first paragraph, the first action beat, the first thing that the reader encounters in your story. Mistake number 2 when it comes to writing your first page, writing the first page first. There's a strong argument that the first page of your novel should be the last page that you write, in that you should write it once the rest of the novel is written. Now, obviously, if you're writing a first draft, then you can write a first page. But just understand that the initial opening that you write to your story may not be the one that works best. By the time you get to the end of the book, your opening might need to be completely different. Hemingway, I think it was Hemingway, has a quote about how you should write the story and then cut chapters from the beginning until you get to the most compelling point to open from. Sanderson has also talked about how he'll commonly rewrite the first 1 to 3 chapters of a book. And Sanderson is a really heavy outliner writer. He uses a fairly detailed outline, as I understand. So I would imagine that he generally knows where a story is going to end, and yet he still will often have to rewrite the opening of the story. A first page needs to link strongly to the rest of the story. This includes things like how the characters behave, all the way down to like tone and mood. A first page that's written first is going to reflect perhaps a lower level of story development, which is why the first page might be best left until the end. Mistake number 3 that can happen on your first page, emphasizing plot or exposition at the expense of character and setting. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I would say the 2 most important things the reader needs to learn about on your first page are who they're following, the character, and where we are following them, the setting. Anything about the world or exposition or the backstory of the character or the events leading up to what they're doing or why what they're doing is important, so anything related to exposition or the plot, I don't think is as important to get to on your first page. Kathy is a middle-aged cook working in the galley of a steamer ship, and there's a big harpoon gun that's hanging right beside the soup ladles. I should know all of that information by the end of your first page. We don't need to know when Kathy got the job or that she's getting paid extra because the ship's route goes through kraken-infested waters. All of this is interesting, but it can come later and Burdening your opening with a long, rambling encyclopedia entry about the economics of moving freight through seas teeming with mythical creatures is just not going to work. A good opening is as much about what you don't tell the reader as it is about what you tell the reader. If you focus too much on exposition and backstory and why the characters are doing what they're doing, you will have a confusing opening. The reader won't have a clear image of what's going on. They won't know who's involved and what they're doing. Instead, focus on dropping hints that allude to other elements coming later on, like a cook having a giant harpoon gun in the kitchen. The reader will be curious why that's there, and then later on you can reveal that it's because of Kraken. Next up, this point is kind of related to the last point, but it bears emphasis. Anything that will confuse the reader in any way. Your opening page is a time for clarity and nothing else. I know you're very clever, but this is not the place to demonstrate that. You can have a confusing and a chaotic opening. Those can work, but there's a difference between the reader understanding that the scene is chaotic and there's a lot of stuff going on, and them just being confused and not understanding that anything is going on. You can clearly demonstrate confusion in your opening. That's different than having a confusing opening. One example of this that I'm still kind of annoyed about because of a recent critique I looked at is having any sort of time skip or flashbacks or any other weird movement through events in your opening. This is just one example, but perhaps the most egregious example of having a confusing opening. There's a common opening that I've seen where there will be some kind of dramatic event like a car crashing or a fight or a character getting stabbed. And we start with that moment, that exciting moment, but then the intro immediately goes back in time to the events leading up to that something happening. I've seen it even where there's like multiple flashbacks to before the opening, and then we work back up to it, and the opening actually starts like right before the event that was the first thing in the opening. I've never seen this effectively done. I'm sure there's somebody out there who has enough writing skill that they'd be able to do it and make it work. If your reader is a sea turtle who's just emerged from its egg into the sand, then an opening that jumps around like this through time is like a seagull swooping down for a snack. It's going to derail them completely. Every time you go to a flashback, you need to reestablish the setting, perhaps introduce more characters, change what actions are happening, and every time you do that, you risk losing the reader. Be very linear with how you move through events in your opening. This also includes things beyond just jumping through time. If you have a ton of characters that get introduced in your opening, that's going to be confusing for the reader and difficult to follow. If you have too intense of an action scene happening, that can be difficult to follow. If you're writing spec fiction, sci-fi, or fantasy, and you have all kinds of weird proper nouns for stuff and weird names that you've made up for different things, that's going to be confusing for the reader. You can have a lot of things happening in your opening, but there's a difference between having a confusing opening that the reader understands is confusing and just having an opening that confuses the reader. You want the former and not the latter. Wait, did I confuse the order of... And the last mistake that you can make on your first page, treating your first page differently from the rest of the novel. Your novel should have a well-written first page because the novel itself is well-written, not because you've put extra emphasis on having a well-written first page. This is tricky because the opening of your novel has an outsized effect on how well the reader will enjoy the rest of it. First impressions matter, and if the reader starts out with a sour taste in their mouth, yes, you might be able to improve that through time as they move through the book, but it will never be something that you completely overcome. A good opening makes readers more likely to stick with a book. It gives you some leeway with less interesting scenes later on because you've gotten on their good side, and it might let you get away with something like a lackluster ending. What the reader thinks about a book is not necessarily governed by logic. it's governed by the feelings that they have. So if your opening creates a good feeling, they will be able to put up with a little bit more BS from the rest of the story if it's lower quality. There are some strong reasons to make sure that your opening and especially your first page are top notch. But that should not come at the expense of the rest of the novel. It should be a result of the rest of the novel being high quality. This gets into the balance between a really marketable book and simply writing a good book. Those are two things that are related but sort of different. If all you cared about was sales and really good reviews, then probably having a really good opening will help you there for the reasons that I've talked about. If, however, you care about the quality of the work that you're producing, then you need to make sure that the rest of the novel lives up to the quality that's set in the opening. You really want to avoid a novel that has a really strong opening and then just kind of peters out with nothing really left to offer the reader. This can happen if you put too much emphasis on improving your opening rather than improving the novel overall. If you just do all the stuff that's involved in writing a good novel, you'll write a good opening. Or rather, a good opening will just sort of emerge out of your novel. Just like the ending has emerged out of this video, because we're now at the ending of this video. Since it's a video about the first page, I didn't really put any effort into writing an ending. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.